So introductions. We should introduce ourselves. So Benjamin
Sounds good.
Rosenbaum is going to introduce himself rather than me doing it. So I could,
But you
but
would do it so capably. I think it'd also be funny if we introduced each other.
yeah.
Um, it's hard to know where to start with oneself. So my name is Benjamin Rosenbaum. I am a dad and writer and computer programmer and rugby flanker. Not anymore. I stopped playing rugby. And I think it would actually be good to. It would sort of be good to introduce ourselves by way of telling how we met, because that sort of
Yeah.
works, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I think so.
So I wanted to be a science fiction writer when I grew up. When I was little, I mean, I think I wanted to be a superhero and an alien and a science fiction writer, but eventually that seemed like the most plausible option of the three. Then I stopped abruptly in college, which we could talk about sometime. It's a good story. And then I decided to start again. And when I was like 29 or 30. Oh, and I think I was 30 when I went to Clarion West, which is one of the couple or three strange little paraliterary science fiction boot camps,
What
which
year
sort
was
of
that?
exists 2001, which is when we met. And which is one of the couple of strange little paraliterary boot camps that sort of exists outside of academia. Like, it's kind of like academia, except not. And it's compressed into 6 weeks. There's no status that translates to the outside academic world, as far as I know. Maybe there is now, not in 2001. And yet all these luminaries of science fiction like jump at the chance to come and teach like a week. Like, I would love to teach Clarion. And so you applied again and you got in, and that's where I met you, because I was at Clarion and you came to talk about a webzine you had just launched, Strange Horizons.
That's
now,
right.
I think.
Yeah,
Am I wrong?
that's absolutely right. So if 2001,
so.
that's yeah, and that was really, it was just very random. I can't remember, I wasn't teaching at Clarion that year. I think I must have just been visiting Seattle. You were at the Seattle one, right? And
Yeah.
I think I just dropped them a note and said, "Hey, I'm in town. Would love to come by and talk to the students if they're around." Was there a convention happening? Was I there for WesterCon maybe?
I don't know.
Or
I don't remember there
Potlatch?
being. Certainly, we didn't go.
You didn't go to
You
the
would think
go.
they would have dragged all the little Clarion kids. I think you were just in town, but it seemed like you were drumming up, submitters to
Well,
your new
yes,
project, right?
yes. I
So
was,
anyway, you were a special guest. It was very you were an impresario, and this, by way of introducing you, this was like not the first genre transforming volunteer foundation that you created, nor would it be the last.
but it was your
Strange
first
Horizons
it was
was
your first
in a series which
encounter
is
with
now
me.
one of the
Yeah,
longest running.
I know.
Yeah. No, I'm saying, but it was definitely my first encounter with you. But I just mean, I encountered you as someone who was, this, like, you're an impresario. You had not only were you in the process of creating out of nothing a new market which would go on to be the longest running, probably the longest running web thing, and in those days too, that was like, it was like one of the very first, like the third or fourth sort of, we are a online magazine which publishes stories online. That was very bizarre and sexy and threatening in 2001, and
people got mad at us.
And
so.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
It was out there. Anyone could just print it, and then they'd have it, and they wouldn't have to pay for another copy. It was terrible.
Well, and
anyway, so
we had no. We knew that we wanted to pay the writers, but we were not thinking about paying for any of the other work that goes into the magazine. And I think I had a really, like, in retrospect, I understand why the print magazine people were kind of mad at us, because we were like, we're just going to ignore this entire aspect of the economy and volunteer our labor. And we were, in some sense, scabbing, right? Like we were undercutting the jobs.
Sure.
Anyway, that's a whole separate side thing. We could do a whole... We should take a note. Hey, our sound engineer, Darius, is listening to this. Darius, can you take a note? We should do a separate episode about the magazines, about online magazines, print magazines, state of the field, It would be interesting to talk about just generally kind of like where short fiction publishing is going, what's been happening with people releasing Kindle Direct things rather than going through a publisher. Even major authors like Lois McMaster Bujold, who has like her latest Penric series has like 5 novelettes that like add up to one novel that she's released as separate things. And I have, you know, as an ardent fan, bought like all 5 of them for $3.99 each or something. So, you know, the equivalent of a $20 hardcover. And now I'll probably buy the hardcover too because I love her so much.
Maybe.
So, you know,
it may be a better model for major authors, actually.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's separate episode. I'm bracketing that. So
yeah. So then we got to know each other as writers and hanger-outers at WisCon. Yes. So yes, I went to Clarion and then I published a whole bunch of stories, and I've written role-playing games, and I don't know.
I'll add a couple other things to your bio just because they interest me. I love that you introduced yourself as a dad first because you know, I do a identity exercise with my students sometimes where as part of building characters, asking them to think through their own identities and what's important to them. And so people will put down all kinds of things, like maybe you are primarily an urban person. I'm a city girl, and that's like super important to my identity. Or I'm Sri Lankan, but maybe I identify mostly as Tamil because that ethnic identity is more important to me than the nationalistic one, or vice versa, right? So maybe gender is important to me, maybe sexual orientation, etc. But one of the things that's interesting about doing in a class of, say, 30 freshmen is you see some trends, and one of the trends is that the women in the class mostly have a relational aspect as one of their identifiers. So early on in their list, if I ask them to list like what are the 5 most important things about you, they will often have things like I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, if I have older students, I'm a wife, I'm a mother. And the men almost never list that, even if they are also husbands and fathers and so on, right?
Sure.
And presumably they are sons. So I think that's an interesting thing about you. I think the fact that you do put that front and center. And in fact, like you think about parenting and fatherhood and children and raising children pretty intensely. And so that's been one of the topics that you and I have talked about a lot, in part because you married a Swiss girl and live in Switzerland a lot of the time, even though you are from America. And so there's a lot of culture-y stuff that goes into raising of kids. And and you had your kids a few years before me, so especially early on, I was asking for advice a lot. And I still remember some of the things you told me about, like letting them, you know, touch the stove because they're gonna if they don't listen to you.
I literally said let them touch the stove.
I'm pretty sure you did. I think you said that you
extreme example.
you said that you would.
I think I said let them fall off things.
No, it was the stove. I remember this very distinctly because I was a little shocked. Right? You said you would warn them. You'd warn them that the stove is hot and they're going to burn themselves. But if they persist in reaching out to touch it anyway, you would sort of stand there and be like, "It's hot. You're going to burn yourself."
Maybe like a pot on the stove. I mean, I would say there's a well, because my whole thing about this, and this is diverging from introductions, but my whole thing about this is the distinction between pain and damage, right?
Right.
Like, so
right. No, and you did talk about that. Yeah.
And so
I'm not saying you touch the burner.
I would not let a kid touch a burner that's on 6.
Right, not the burner.
Because that might be like a scar forever. Right. But like a pot that's like simmering, sure. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's gonna hurt. You're right. Yeah, I'm definitely, I mean, I think that is like, and I think there's something there where it's like, you will drive yourself crazy as a parent trying to protect your kids from pain. And you know what I mean? I mean, like, that's your impulse. Your impulse is to protect them from all pain. Not, you know, falling off the couch or touching a hot pan or like, you know, going out with the wrong person, like, you know, like that, like whatever, like being friends with, and that, and you can't actually protect them from pain. And in fact, it's far more useful for you to be an ally, a reliable ally. So if your track record is like, I don't think you should do that, it will hurt, and then you let them and they die, then they're like,
Yeah,
that's
Dad
just,
knows what he's
then
talking about.
you're a reliable. And and the other side of that is, if you're not like, you may not do that because I'm afraid it will hurt you. Like, you have to be, for them to trust you, you have to be willing to be, you may not do that. I'm forbidding you because it will damage you. Like, that's a
Right.
backstop. Like, they want their parents to be like, you may not do things that will damage you. But
Right.
if they know that you're going to stop them from doing things that will just hurt but not damage them, they're not going to tell you about those things. You know what I mean? They're just going to go do them. And they are, you are deprived of the opportunity for oversight, and they're deprived of your wise counsel. So, you know what I mean? It's a hard muscle to develop, to be like, that's a bad idea. Let's, but I'm here for you. Like,
so that's an example. That's one of the little parenting lessons discussions that we had early on that I think was pretty interesting to me. And then there's a bunch more, but we'll save those for later episodes. We have to come back to the whole thing about walking on the road and getting hit by cars, but we'll come back to that.
I'm also I want to hear about that too. I do not remember advising you to let your kids get hit by cars. I am a synagogue board member.
Well, I was going to come to that. I was going to say the other main thing that I would pull out, aside from you being a science fiction writer and are talking about that a lot, is that because you are so deeply involved with your synagogue, I think religion and community management, I don't know if management is the word, but thinking through how to enhance your community and support people within it is a big part of what you do, and it's a big part of what I do in different ways. And so, what is the term for what you do? Is there a technical term, or are you?
A goodbye? I mean,
well, I don't know. Like I was raised. I'm not religious, but I was raised Catholic, and I'm trying to remember what the term is. But there's a term for not a priest, but a lay person who is
right, like a deacon or something.
I think deacon might be the term, right?
I mean, yes, right. That's a pretty goyish term. I mean, it wouldn't apply to me, therefore.
Okay.
I mean, synagogue board member is a relatively new institution, right? It's.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, in the last few centuries. So I don't know. Like, I'm also a gabai, which means I call people up to the Torah, but that's like a very small. Like, there are traditional Hebrew names for some aspects of what I sometimes do, but it's but those, really it's very interesting because it's a very ancient religion, and it's also sort of a very modern democratic, very Swiss institution, like being, this is just very definitely bylaws, and the Swiss care a lot about bylaws and electing officers and having there's a very important, every Swiss person to the first approximation is in a verein, like is in a club, and the clubs in Switzerland, like if you have 4 guys who play basketball every Wednesday night, they will elect a president, a secretary, a treasurer, and a vice president, and have as soon as there's money, as soon as they rent a basketball, and then they have an annual meeting. And at the annual meeting, the people have to discharge. They have to formally discharge the board of their duties of the prior year, and then only then may you proceed to the next. Anyway, so I don't know why I'm telling you that, but it's funny because it's on the border between democracy and it's a democratic institution, which is an interesting aspect. I've learned a lot about democracy being a synagogue board member. But also Judaism plays a big role in my fiction, particularly lately. I mean, I think it was more oblique in the beginning, and it's become more and more overt as time goes on.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not, as I said, I'm not religious, but I think a lot about, I don't know. It's almost like I wish I were religious, and, I had that moment in Catholic school in 7th grade where I was arguing with my teacher about this, and she was sort of saying, you have to just take the leap of faith. And I was like, I do not think I can do that. So this is Judaism does not require the same leap of faith that Catholicism asks of you. So maybe I could be a good Jew. I don't know.
I do sometimes feel a little sorry for some of the Goyim, because it's kind of like, you apparently, I don't know. I mean, I'm just observing this from the outside, but you apparently have to like take a position on God
You do,
before you
yeah.
get to do the whole Catholicism thing, which seems like a shame because there's lots of fun stuff in Catholicism. Stained glass windows and organs and robes and, why do you have to take a position on God in order to get all the fun stuff? That seems
I mean, you can still go to church.
From my
It's not like you can't go to church, but you can go to church and be apostate. I'm not sure. I'm talking about things that I really don't know anything about. So
well, I identify as a sort of postmodern theist. I mean, it really depends on the day, and my position on it is very fluid and weird. But certainly, like, most of the people in my synagogue are atheists. I mean, and my kids who are extremely active and like lead programs and teach about teach Sunday school and are both, I think, atheists. Well, I don't know. Noah's, I believe, agnostic. It might be unfair to say that they're atheists, but certainly they.
Well, and I would call myself a strong agnostic. There's a thing in there used to be this woman that came to conventions who I don't remember her name. We called her the button lady, and she had all these thousands of buttons that she would sell, many of which were quite funny, and she had some that were strong agnostic was. What was it? It was like, I don't know and you don't either, and then right, and then nice. And weak agnostic was I don't know and I don't care, and at one point I postulated, and she actually made this into a button, and occasionally I see people wearing it at conventions, relaxed bisexual agnostic, I don't know, I don't care, and maybe I'll sleep with it, I think of it as like the Captain Jack version of religion, right? So
right, yeah. I mean, there's something to be said for that. Yeah. Noah's an agnostic with an I. Mm-hmm. So there's an agnostic with an I, apparently.
I don't know what that is.
Which is to say that he thinks it's wrong. It means it's the wrong question. Like, I think the button would say, like, strong agnostic, that's not even a thing.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So, all right. So, anyway. And I think I actually got the shtick right. It was strong agnostic, I don't know, and you don't either. I don't remember what weak agnostic is. It's relaxed agnostic was I don't know and I don't care. But cool. Anyway, leaving the buttons aside, let me do my intro because I think it'll then tie into all of this stuff. So I was born in Sri Lanka. I came to the U.S. when I was 2. This is not going to be a super long intro, even though I started with my birth.
It can be.
It can be. I know, but it's like, what is that novel that starts with the really long early English novel? I should know this. They're gonna like take away my PhD. Starts with the.
I'm picturing them pulling up outside your house in a black SUV with the PhD takeawayers.
Well, there's this moment in one of the David Lodge novels where there's a bunch of. So David Lodge is a comedy writer. He writes about academia. They're very funny. One of his novels is Small World, where they are. It's a bunch of academics on going to conventions. So they're flying what we cannot do right now in the age of coronavirus, but they're flying around the world to conventions in order to get laid, basically. So it's all about the bed hopping hijinks of the professors. And it's a very funny book. And there's a moment where they're all sitting in a hotel room playing a drinking game called Shame, where they have to say, like, I've never read Grapes of Wrath, and everyone who has it takes a drink, right? And so, I've never read blah, blah, blah. So all of these tenured faculty, right? And and then it's a very funny, I'm going to spoil this moment in the book because what happens is, they go around and then someone's like, I've never read Hamlet, and everyone just goes, and like the game is over. He's destroyed his career in academia. This is the one thing.
The game is over.
You can't admit that, So anyway, I have read Hamlet, but I can't. It's not Tom Jones, is it?
I'm relieved.
Is it the novel that's really long, that's sometimes called the first novel, that starts with the guy being born?
It might be Tom Jones.
I can't remember. I should look it up. But and I think Rushdie uses that somewhat as a model farcical reference to With Midnight's Children, because he starts with this whole thing about the birth of his protagonist with the huge nose, and it goes from there. Anyway.
Yeah.
This is not that. This will not end up being the longest novel in the English language as I tell you my biography, but I grew up in Connecticut, avid genre reader. You know, like I'd search out the books with the rocket ships and the dragons on the spines at the library. My dad would often, would like drop me at the library on Saturday morning. I would sit there and read for like 8 hours straight, come home with 20 books, be done with them by Wednesday. This was during the summer when I had nothing to do but read. And then be waiting impatiently until Saturday when he could take me to the library again. So that was who I was as a kid. I grew up, I became an English major at the University of Chicago, and thought I was going to be a professor, but I did not. My grades weren't good enough to get into any of the schools I applied to. So then I was a little lost. I typed really fast because I grew up in a Polish Catholic community that had us all take, it was a working class community, and I think they expected that many of us would end up in pink collar jobs. So we had 2 years of typing, which has been incredibly useful to me. I graduated 8th grade typing 60 words a minute, finished college typing 120 words a minute just from practice. So I was always able to get gigs as an executive secretary, which is a pretty sweet gig, temping. And I did that for years. And at some point in one of those jobs, I had gotten some temp job that was receptionist, so I wasn't allowed to read because they thought it looked bad. That was a totally standard thing. I'm sure it still is, that you can't like sit with a book in front of you, even though all you're doing is sitting here waiting for the phone to ring, which it rings like once an hour, right? So at some of these places, but this was like the early days of computers. So I had, 1993, 94, like there would be a computer in front of me, often without internet access because there was no, lots of places didn't have internet yet. So I could write. And so I found myself writing poetry for the most part. So I spent like a year writing poetry, and then realized that I was not going to be able to probably make a living writing poetry, but maybe I could with fiction. And I had written some fiction before, and that's a whole nother episode, I suppose, about how in college I was writing erotica and putting it on the internet and the shame of my parents and blah, 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 blah. But
it's one of my favorite stories.
It's a good story, but it's a long story. So we'll table that for now, how I made myself a scandal and a hissing in the Sri Lankan community. But I decided to write fiction. I applied to MFA programs, and this is where we intersect because this is where Clarion comes in. I ended up getting into the Mills College MFA program in California. I went out there, and halfway through that program, I went and applied to Clarion and did Clarion in Seattle in 1997. And Clarion, it was called Clarion West at the time, I think still is. And and from that, sort of like, and I had a little bit of a side path here because what happened is I went there thinking, I really, really want to be a science fiction fantasy writer because I love the genre so much. I'd been writing mainstream lit in my program, and there was some good stuff there, but I wanted to write an epic fantasy novel perhaps. And we got to week 4 where we had some tour editors, Beth Meacham and Tappan King, who came to listen to our pitches, right? And I wrote this pitch, and it bombed. It's so bombed. I was the first one to volunteer to go. Typical South Asian, overachieving kid, head of the class, hand up in the air. I am the Hermione Granger of this story. So, but I did not have the right answer. So it just went around the room with one person after another person basically kindly saying, your synopsis sucks. No one would ever want to read this novel. They were really, I mean, by the third person, when it became clear that this was going to be a bomb, everyone was very nice about it, but still. And then when we had our little consultation.
One of the downsides of Clarion.
Yeah, well.
Is the emotional is like you have to hear 16 people say that. That's the.
Yeah, well, and it's rare to have everyone agree that this was really bad. But and part of the problem was that I had written a summary and not a synopsis, and so I had some misunderstanding of the form. But leaving that aside, I then had my consultation with the editors. We had like these little 30-minute things afterwards with the visiting teachers. And they said they had read my earlier stories, which had all been kind of a little more in the magical realist vein. They were literary, right? They paid attention to characterization and prose style and whateverness, and they had like a little touch of the fantastic in them, right? And rather than being embedded in the heart of the field, and they sort of said, we think your heart is in mainstream fiction, not in genre, and that's what you should be doing. And I went back to my room, my little dorm room. I called up my boyfriend and I bawled. I cried for like half an hour. I'm never going to be a genre writer. I guess I just have to write mainstream fiction. This sucks, right?
There's something very, I realize this is your actual life, and it is actually a very sad and traumatic experience, but there's something kind of hilariously inverted from how like the story is usually told. There's a wonderful, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of like doomed to the dark outer precincts of literary fiction, and forced to write for
Granta. Yeah, that would be nice.
I mean, I was gonna say Granta. That's what I was going to say. Forced to write for Granta, but I was like, well, I don't know if she actually wrote for Granta, so maybe that's.
No.
But I was like, yeah, that's
Granta,
nice.
call me.
I like that. So I could be. Yeah, exactly.
I've gotten some good rejections from Granta and Harper's and Atlantic, and so on. I have a nice queue of those kind rejections. So, So anyway, I went away and I basically stopped writing genre fiction. I mean, I finished off Clarion. I didn't like leave in a huff, but I and I enjoyed my time there immensely, and had the usual mad crush and etc. So I'm very glad I went, and
it probably helped transform you into a prominent genre editor too. I mean, that's the other side of that's another piece of your career besides as a writer.
I think it helped embed me in the field in that way, right? Yeah, and I met some people. I got to week 2 was the reason I went to Clarion was because Chip Delaney was teaching week 2, Samuel R. Delaney, and he was my idol. I wrote my bachelor's thesis on him, and I wanted to be him.
I was going to say there's a way in which I was going to say it'd also be interesting to have an episode when you were talking about what you grew up reading and sort of seeking out the books of the dragons. I think it'd be interesting to talk about what we imprinted on both like overlap and also what's both different, what does and doesn't overlap.
Oh, that would be great. Darius?
I never read any. What?
You've never read any Delaney? Oh my God!
No. Opposite. No. Wait, I paused because you were saying to him. No, Delaney is in the overlap. No, I never read any Bujold until you turned me on to Bujold, for instance, which is one of your big hallmarks, but like I hadn't read. But Delaney is an intersection of ours, and I mean, in fact, it's you could argue that we. Presumably that on some level that's why we met, because I also went to Clarion. I did not go when Delaney was going, but I realized I wanted to go to Clarion because I saw that he was teaching. He taught in 2000. And I was like, oh my God, that would be. And then I had missed the deadline, or I wasn't ready, or whatever. And then Octavia Butler was teaching the next year.
God.
So I was like,
I
had Octavia Butler.
I know, no. She's the one who, I mean, Butler and Le Guin are the ones that if I could have, like those are the two. But they're my 3 influences there.
Exactly.
But,
exactly. And those are kind of my 3 core influences.
But we should do an episode about this, and in part because I'd love to. If we do that, we should think about doing it with some guest people for pieces of it at least. Because, for example, when I went to Sri Lanka. God, it was like a year and a half ago now. I met Udhanjaya Vijayaratne, and he is an ardent, up-and-coming, brilliant young writer, and we were talking about all the things we read that we have in common. We have a lot of the same taste in books. We brought him out to Chicago for the Deep Dish reading series, and so he stayed at my house, and like all my bookshelves, he had read half the books on my shelves, right? But he'd never read Delaney because there is no Delaney in any bookstores in Sri Lanka, right? And it's just like this massive, horrible gap. And I'm like, oh my God, that's terrible, right? So, and he, and there was this moment, like he was posting about it on Facebook, and I was like, oh my God, I have to organize a mission to send many copies of Delaney to Sri Lanka, and and I was like literally like going to start like funding this, right? And then like one of his friends from Sri Lanka is like, dude, you can buy electronic copies, like go buy some. And, and I was like, oh, right, okay, I don't actually have to like organize this.
Oh, right.
Send the print books
to
Sri Lanka
1993, I would need a crate of books.
So then he went and bought some digital copies and has read them since. So, and I'll take this.
So anyway, that's a primary intersection of ours.
That is a primary intersection of ours, and we should do a whole episode about it. So anyway, I'll wrap up this bio to say that I went back, I wrote mainstream lit, I finished the MFA, I did some tech writing to pay off my MFA debt for a while, then I ended up following my boyfriend, Kevin, to Utah, to Salt Lake City, where he was doing a postdoc, and I did some adjunct teaching of freshman comp, as one does after an MFA, and discovered they had a PhD program in creative writing, which was just barely a thing at that point, and this seemed like the best thing ever. So I applied, got in by the skin of my teeth. I was waitlisted, but thankfully they let me in. I did like meet with this is relevant. I met with a professor there when I was applying to like get her advice on my application, and she kindly read it and said, I'm sorry, I think you're too commercial for our program. I don't think you're going to be a good fit. I am stubborn enough.
Damned if you do.
I'm applying anyway. But it was a funny moment. Like the genre people were saying I was too literary, and the literary people apparently think I'm too commercial, and what does that mean?
I know them feels.
Yeah. So, but I applied, I got in, and ended up writing this book, Bodies in Motion, which was Sri Lankan immigrant fiction, almost entirely realistic, although there's this one kind of magical realist moment at one point, but it might just be in her head. And that got picked up by HarperCollins.
It's a great
and
book.
I love that book. I worked on it really hard for 4 years. It's a good book. So I
wonder whether if you imprint on Samuel Delaney as a young age, you are setting yourself up for being told for the rest of your career that you're too literary for genre and too genre for literary. I mean, come on. Certainly happened to me. I mean.
Yeah. No, I suppose it's possible. Although, he's brilliant enough. He managed to win all the awards anyway. So,
yeah, but it's true. But he I think then at some point departed from the field in a lot of ways, kind of unsatisfied with how anyway. That's a different conversation.
It's a different conversation because I think it's more about sort of the content of his books perhaps than the prose quality, right, or any of that. So okay, so I don't know. How do I finish this up? I'm jumping ahead. I am now a professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I'm in the English department. I teach all kinds of things: creative writing, post-colonial lit, science fiction, fantasy, also whatever else they ask me to teach. So sometimes queer lit, sometimes women in lit, sometimes Asian American lit. I live with my husband, Kevin, who is a theoretical math professor, a topologist. I don't understand anything he does. We have 2 kids, Kavya and Anand, who are currently 10 and almost 13. Sorry, I got those reversed. So Anand is 10, Kavya is almost 13, and we'll probably, Ben and I being who we are, we'll probably reference the kids during these. So you need to know who they are. And Kevin and I are poly, so I have one other long-term sweetie, Jed, who also went to Clarion, and who lives in the Bay Area, and we have been socially distanced from him for 2 months, which is sad. I miss him. I'm trying to think if there's anything else really essential. I have a dog and 2 cats. I garden.
I think that was.
I garden. Well, I garden and I cook it. And I guess that's the last thing is my most recent book is a Sri Lankan cookbook, A Feast of Serendib. And the last several years, I've been trying to navigate an increasing interest in domesticity, but also maintaining my interest in science fiction and fantasy. And I am the despair of my agent, who would really like me to pick one. And I mean, he would like me to pick science fiction, but any agent would want me to pick something and stick to it, because it's way easier to build a brand with one thing. And I persist in being pretty committed to both of these.
Preach.
Yeah. So
well,
and I have ADD.
I mean that there's a lot of strands. So I was going to say, I mean, and I think you touched on them, but I mean, one thing is that you're actually, I mean, one thing that's you have an outsized role in certain ways in science fiction community, both as an organizer, I mean, not just science fiction, but a lot of communities, both as a aggregator of people, as a leader, as a creator of organizations and entities, you know what I mean? Like that's an enormous kind of work and also, like, in terms of your I think at certain various points in recent science fiction history, you've had a crucial role as a voice around community and political issues, and you know, sort of I mean, in a really like in a really good way, like a really, like, was that a noise of dissatisfaction? Because I feel like this is
it's accurate.
A very positive impact.
It's an interesting, you know, science fiction. So I didn't mention the things that I've done in the field. So like with Jed and a bunch of other people, we started Strange Horizons. I ran it for 2 years and then handed it off to Susan Groppe, who has handed off to others, and certainly it's entirely possible that my biggest literary achievement will be having started that magazine, which is going to hit its 20th anniversary very shortly, which is amazing to me. So I did that.
And it has been really focused on diversity and new writers and a lot of things that were, you know, relatively groundbreaking.
Yeah, and that's why we started it. And we should talk about, Darius, make a note in a future episode, we should talk about why we started Strange Horizons and how it has or hasn't fulfilled its promise. I mean, I think it has, very much so, and I'd love to do that episode with Charlie Jane Anders and Annalee Newitz, because I've talked with them about it, and they also have a really great sense of the field. So let's bring them in as guest people on that episode. So, and if I can get Ellen Datlow and Sheila Williams to come in as well,
for the magazine episode.
Yeah, magazine episode, that would be sort of fascinating. Maybe Eileen Gunn, who did Infinite Matrix. So back at the
but you also
day.
Started the Speculative Literature Foundation,
and then I currently run
Jaggery and
so I start things. I do start things. I maybe start too many things. I think this may be.
I mean, you start things and they flourish.
So I think an overlap between us is that we have a strong interest in community, an area, you know, and in fostering community and like thinking through how do we help people's lives be better? Does that make, you know, like on a very basic, simple level, you know, and I tend to think of it as the bossy auntie in my case. Like I'm 48 years old, almost 49, and I've graduated, you know, to like good auntie status. Like I'm the good auntie. I'm the one who you can come and tell me you're pregnant and I'm going to help you sort it out, you know, but I'm also the one who is going to sit you down and say, Kunju, what are you doing with your life right now? You know, like, is this really what you want to be doing? So
nice to have achieved auntyhood.
I love it. I really do. And it's like the best role. And I think we need to reclaim it. There's actually a podcast, Bad Brown Aunties, which I'm like, I want to be a guest on that because, like, I want to be one of them. But
nice.
But the I guess a difference, I think, in how you and I approach things is that I don't think you have the same impulse I have. That when I see a problem, like with Strange Horizons, the problem was that there weren't enough slots for pro writers in the field. My immediate impulse is to fix it. Like I'm a compulsive fixer, and to fix it in a systematic way that will be self-supporting without me in 2 years. That's my goal, right? It's always my goal is to like, how can I build a structure that I can then walk away from that's going to
I mean, we have that in common in the sense that I don't found organizations every 10 minutes, but we do have that in common that I learned to, I mean, through trial and error, to not I mean, I'm very, I don't start a lot of things necessarily, but I do have it often end up as sort of glue in communities. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? Like, I think early experience of getting your parents to stop fighting is
Yeah.
crucial in this biography. But, but, um, but, and I remember having distinct experiences of sort of like realizing that things that if I help too much, things are dependent on me. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I go away and then they break. You know,
Right.
and after having a couple of those experiences, I really and I think I also consciously have tried to emulate you in some regards, but that you've been an influence. But I think it's really crucial to have that ability of like setting things up and then having them scale, like having
Yeah.
them like if it all needs me all the time, then I haven't actually created anything that I've just given myself more jobs, but I haven't actually created anything
No,
that can live.
and I think
You
that
know,
scalability thing is like a tech thing that I mean I think literally I started thinking about that more when I was looking at like grants from Google and saw that they gave
yeah,
priority to
yeah,
projects that scaled well. And I was like, oh, I've
yeah.
never thought in those terms before. And I think there's a
I
super
mean,
interesting tension between the local
yeah,
and the scalable.
yeah.
And that's
Yeah, and I
sorry,
think I think
Darius,
there's a
make
I
a
think there's
note.
a
That would be a really great episode in itself, the local versus
yeah,
scalable.
I think there's
So
a and there's definitely right, there's definitely a seductive danger in the tech geek idea of scalability, where it's sort
right,
of like that way does lie dystopian horror taken to extreme, right?
right.
But certainly there's a happy medium, right? So and
One
there's
hopes.
some well, I don't know, like for any given, well, it's an optimization question.
Yeah,
For any given situation, like a lot of times this drive towards scalability creates horror because you lose the human level and you have
yeah,
this, I don't know, you have the bots turning the world into gray goo. That's
right.
where that's the end of scalability. But certainly the other side of that is, somebody being just like inundated with like so many people start a thing and then are stuck in it like a tar baby, like they can't escape from the morass of like and to be able to
I think of this as
um
the
yeah
PTO problem. Like when our kids started school, I
yeah
signed up for the PTO, right? And
yeah
Kevin
yeah
didn't want to. And we had
uh-huh,
a little bit of an argument about this because he was like,
yeah
I was sort of like, you're a guy, we should have men in the PTO too,
yeah
and it shouldn't all
uh-huh
be carried by women. You and I have very similar jobs, and, like it's not,
yeah
it's,
sure
so, and his argument was the PTO is just a waste of it's such an
mm-hmm,
inefficient way to raise money for the
mm-hmm,
school,
uh-huh
having these bake sales and so on. Like, can't we just go and like, I don't know what it was he was imagining, but
right
some other, larger scale fundraiser or whatever
mm-hmm,
thing that just make more money and donate it to the school and then be done with it and not have to
yeah
go and do this. And I
yeah
was like, you're missing the communal aspect of
yeah
like
yeah
it matters that the moms come together and ideally the dads
right
come together too and are like standing in the rain at the bake sale, right? Like, and having a
yeah
conversation because that's where you find the resources for your
yeah
ADHD son, right? Like, this is that there's
to
a
some extent the fundraising is just an excuse. I mean, or it should. I mean, really, it
right,
shouldn't. You shouldn't need the fundraising. It's a different
right. You
conversation.
shouldn't need the
It's very
fundraising.
weird. It's very weird as a European. Like we
Yeah.
spent a couple of years when my kids were. My son spent the last year of elementary school when we were in DC for 2 years. It was
Hmm.
extremely weird to like move to DC and send my kids to public school and then realize, oh, it's not actually public school. Like, do you know what I mean? Not by Swiss standards. Like, yes, it's the public school, but like here in Ward 3 in the rich white part of DC, like there is an entire aide in this classroom paid for by like the PTA raising money, which is like
Yeah.
that's a semi-private school.
Right. And our,
That's,
like our school, the PTO, like had someone who could write good grants. And so all the kindergartners had iPads, right? Like,
right, and
you
that
know,
was not the case in Ward 8. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like I was sitting in DC, it was like, really, this is anyway. So,
yeah.
yeah,
So anyway, so that again, we'll come back to this. That's a whole episode in and of itself, thinking about kind of like what's valuable at the local level and what can
yeah,
be done on a larger scale thing. I guess what I wanted to kind of pull out, you don't have the same impulse to start things that I do and to like
mm,
build systems, but I think what I find really valuable talking to you about these things, whether we're talking about the structure of SIFWA or the SLF or any of these larger scale things, is that I get impatient. And this is partly because I have ADD and I have a billion ideas at once. You also have a billion ideas at once, but I get very impatient, and I have a real tendency to do like, well, this is good enough, right? There's that term satisfice, which is, so like a lot of how I get things done, and I get a lot done, is because I'm willing to satisfy many things, right? Like I can make, yesterday I made 2 batches of elaborate star bread. The only reason I had time to do that was because we ordered a massive amount of Thai takeout earlier in the week. So like I haven't cooked meals in like 6 days, right? So, and that's fine. I'm perfectly willing to eat the same Thai food over and over and over again. Like that's good enough, and I'm happy, and it's supporting a local restaurant during the pandemic, and we can afford to do it, and that's a luxury, and I'm grateful to have it, right? Like, so sorry, that was a little side tangent. So, but being willing to satisfy, I think, can be dangerous. And I think one reason why you don't start things and run with them quite as fast as I do, and I'd say this is also true of Jed, and it's something I really, and Kevin, I value about all 3 of you, is that you think things through more deeply and more carefully. No, you do. And you in particular are somewhat actually you're all uncompromising about sort of the morality, the ethics. And I'm thinking of things like in science fiction, when Elizabeth Moon had been invited to be guest of honor at WisCon, and then they were rescinding her invitation because of a racial issue that had come up online. And I was upset about that, and I was thinking, this isn't fair. This is given for her books. This is something that I love her books. I think they're so important and valuable to the field. There was a reason why they chose to honor her, and the fact that she has perhaps a flaw in this area is not. And you and I had a long conversation, and it took you, I want to say, maybe 2 hours to, you may not remember this, but it made a big impact on me, because you just kind of kept at me explaining why it was that it was important that someone who was, it wasn't just a book award, right? That this was guest of honor, and guest of honor was representing the convention, and it says something about the con. Who you choose as your guest of honor, it says something about who is welcome and who's not welcome at that convention that year. Anyway, so you made me think it through, and I don't know that I would have otherwise. I'm very impulsive and quick, and so you slow me down.
That's one big.
Oh wait, sorry. Say that again. I lost you for a sec.
No, I quipped. You're welcome for slowing me down. But
you're really, I'm sorry, Ben, you're really soft right now. Like you keep kind of like fading in and out.
Did I move the, am I
okay,
how's that?
Okay, I think
better?
you're good now.
I think this mic is very sensitive. No, I quipped, you're welcome for slowing me down.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know, I don't think of that as uncompromising necessarily. I mean, that the situation that you're describing, it's like I actually think that you and I are similar politically in the sense that we're very, I mean, you are also very, have a lot of integrity, and you're very bold, but you also, I think both of us are very strongly seeking nuance and, like the specific details of the case and so on. Like, in that case, I mean, I think there was a popular position to say, this person has done this thing, they're a bad person, done.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's totally not my position. And my position was if she had won the Tiptree, they should invite her. A guest of honor is a different job. Like, do you fulfill the qualifications for this job? The job of the guest of honor is to unite, this community. Yeah. It's more than I'm giving you this plaque. It's you're working. You've been guest of honor at Wisconsin. You're working, and the guest of honor is this is a very important moment where they give this speech that really and if you have just said something obnoxious, I don't know. I'm not saying it's necessarily that somebody's political faux pas is unforgivable, but if you just said something obnoxious that has alienated half of the community, you have made it impossible for you to do the job, and it is a job, right? So it's not you don't deserve to be. You know what I mean? It's not a matter of your work has merited this award. It's a matter of we decided that you were a person who had the judgment and standing and ability to do this really important job in this community, and oops.
Well, and
that up that's a,
right. And I mean, I don't know whether you remember, but when I was guest of honor, I screwed up badly on a panel that year in the convention, and then I ended up.
Different case.
No. It's actually what happened was that, this was a panel. I'm going to go ahead and go into this because I think it's relevant. The panel was, I think it was called The Language of Fail. It was a panel that was about what do you do when you mess up badly in public on one of these, social justice type issues, when you show your ass. Sorry, bleep that out if we're
I don't know how.
I don't know. Are we swearing? I think it's probably
I don't know.
fine.
I think we should probably swear.
This is not public radio. I also almost never swear, so it's not going to come up very often. But Catholic schoolgirl, right? I actually never swore growing up, and I tried in high school, and my best friend was like, "You should not swear. You don't do it right." So,
you don't do it right.
So
I swear judiciously.
So I'm using the phrase though, "show your ass," right? So and it's kind of funny because this is in quotes, "show your ass." I can say it where I wouldn't otherwise, perhaps. And that's actually what happened on the panel, is that we were talking about the use of the N-word, and I said the word, and I said it in quotes. I think I had my fingers probably doing the air quotes at the time because I was quoting something about it, and then someone in the audience kind of raised their hand, and they were like, "Look, I understand that you were just quoting it, but just hearing you say that is upsetting and hurtful." And what happened in that moment, so here I was, Language of Fail panel. I had now been called out publicly.
Decided to give an example of
of how to fail. Yeah, if only.
We'll now have a real-time exercise.
So the moderator actually stepped in and kind of thanked them for their feedback and kind of tried to protect me a little by shifting the topic and calling on someone else. And I sat there bathed in humiliation because as I was saying it, even though it was in quotes, it felt so weird coming out of my mouth, and I was kind of regretting it immediately. And it was almost like I was trying too hard, and that was why it came out. Anyway, I ended up interrupting, and I was like, I can't let this go. I can't let you protect me in this moment. And I think the only reason I had the fortitude to do that was because I was guest of honor, right? I was like, I cannot. I cannot.
That's exactly what I was saying.
Right. That's why I'm connecting it.
You're conscious of the fact that your job does in fact require that you cannot.
Right. I have to stand up and model how you're supposed to handle this. So now you guys have all told me.
Right, which is why it was a different case. Which is why it was a different case.
But it's a related case.
But I think
I could have easily not done it. That's the thing. I almost did not have the emotional strength to apologize.
A and B, you could have also doubled down, which is what Elizabeth Moon did, as far as I understand. As I recall, it was a while ago. But what very often in very often happens in these situations. She apologized and then doubled down. But yes, and then de-apologized. That's very typical, right? I mean, which is not to say I'm all about teshuvah, right? I'm all about redemption, earned redemption, right? Like I have a very I have a very Jewish model of forgiveness, which is to say, which is interesting because there's not quite as much hasty urgency to forgive, right? Yeah. There is a beautiful aspect in Christianity, which is this making forgiveness a paramount virtue, but it has this downside that there's sort of a little bit of an unsustainability about saying, essentially, if you say that it's incumbent upon good people to forgive, then the only kind of out that you have if you're not going to forgive is that the person is not worthy of forgiveness, they're so bad or it was so bad. If, in fact, forgiveness is something that only happens after, once the person has atoned and made redemption and satisfied, they have to have erased the bad thing they did from the world, and only then is it incumbent upon you to forgive. Then, you know what I mean? There's not so much pressure. But the gates of redemption are always open. Nobody ever fucks up so bad that they can't make up for it, right? I mean, I don't know, which is a bit of a radical position because, Hitler. But there's on some level, it's
well, and I think
time travel, kidnap Hitler, and take him to the appropriate,
This is where I think you and I are. I mean,
re-education facility.
Well,
Anyway, let's not Godwin's law the conversation. But what I was going to say is,
no. Finish what you're saying. But I want to connect that to Spock because
okay, let's go back to Spock. But what
yes.
I was going to say is that the crucial thing is the recovery. You know, people have it like the progressives are out to get you, and if you ever screw up, you will die in the flames. But in fact, what happens is, and it's very understandable, but there is a vicious cycle, and we saw this. You know, we were both, I think, had front row seats, and you were instrumental in Race Fail 2009.
Yeah.
I mean, I was watching it unfold, and there was a, and in fact, what happens is that people screw up, you know, particularly because they're miseducated. So if you're if you're have privilege, then you're like, you know, like it was like, you know, the obvious example of Raceville was sort of like there was when Scalzi was like, what's the big deal? Why are you why don't pay attention to this kerfuffle?
Right.
That was the kind of like, you know, dumb privileged thing that, like, you know, as a white person, you know, like you're gonna do, right, in a conversation on racism. And the difference between that and like the Nielsen's Hayden's snarking at it and then doubling down is that Scalzi had like relationships with like you and Tempest, and like a bunch of people came and called him on his shit, and I may not have the exact people right, but you know what I mean? And he ended up
I want to say, people actually, it wasn't me. I knew him a little, but I think Tempest actually knew him, and maybe Mary Robinette, like, literally called him on the phone. And I think that's an important, like, they made that intervention, right?
Exactly. And the thing, that's why it seems to me like the recipe for these sorts of things is you actually, the work is done beforehand. Like if you have already done, when it's not a big crisis where everyone is yelling at each other, if you have created the relationships where there are relationships of trust where people will come and say, this is a blind spot of yours, then in fact, it's predictable that you'll be able to do what he did, which is like, okay, I fucked up, and now we're going to yield the floor, and I'm going to give this huge microphone I have to Marianne and Tempest. Right? And that is a save. Whereas if you are surrounded by people who are going to like often what happens is somebody makes an initial apology. The people who are still mad say some more mad things because they're still mad because your apology did not magically vanish them being mad. Right. Then the people around you start getting into it with them, and there's some kind of ad hominem, like they're fighting each other and taking up swords on your behalf, your crowd. And then you unapologize and double down. Like that's a very typical anti-pattern.
And it's
right?
super human, right? Like when that incident happened on the panel, right? So I apologized, which I think was the right thing to do in the moment. I talked through it. Like I was like, I am feeling shame. My face is super hot. You know, like it's actually really difficult to talk through this. I'm a little like I'm on the verge of tears, but like clearly I owe this and I'm going to do it. And then I actually ended up sometime later writing it up for my blog because I'm like, this is another necessary part of the restitution, I guess, to like, you know, like write this, maybe not necessary, but like, let me explain what happened and talk through it. And it's scary to do that. You're kind of exposed, you know, you take it from like the 100 people in the room to the world, potentially, to see how you showed your ass. And, and I still want that particular woman to come back and forgive me, right? Like there's a level in which, you know, I'm sitting here, you know, like, and she does not owe me that. Nobody owes me that, right? Like, you know, like, but there's I want her to come and say, Marianne, you have made up for everything you did. You've erased it. And
you're absolved.
You're absolved, right? Like, you know,
I'm with you.
Catholic girl, you know, like absolution is part of, you know, you repent and then God forgives you. So I think that's, anyway, I'm not sure. I'm just babbling now,
and
but I think
no guarantee.
And that's part of the, and it doesn't matter, right? Like whether she forgives me or not, I think there's a great moment in Bejeweled where Miles is struggling with sort of like social opinion of him being terrible, and his dad says to him, like, you know, it's not about what reputation, I'm going to get this right, reputation is what other people know about you, honor is what you know about yourself, is I believe the quote, right? And so there's a sort of sense of like, you have to get to a point of like, okay, I now am confident that I've done everything I know to do to make up for this thing. And I'll keep listening in case, somehow I'm missing something, but basically I think I'm okay now. That's never going to be any guarantee that the world is going to agree with you on that, right?
Sure.
You may still be soaking in.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
It's a hard place to be.
But I think that the thing I was to bring this back originally to the original thing we were saying about being uncompromising and whether it's sort of like, I don't actually think that it's the first round that's usually crucial. You know what I mean? I think most things that people do wrong are recoverable, and but tensions are running high, and there's this very typical anti-pattern where your defenders have spoken up for you and gotten attacked for it, and so now you must defend your defenders. Right. Which makes it very hard to stay. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of then you get teams. So what's actually really necessary?
Did right. Yeah.
That's what he did right. Yes, because if you're gonna, he squashed his own defenders.
He was like defenders. Yeah.
Exactly, and you have to do that. You have to have that muscle. If you screw up, it's not just your job to apologize. You apologize, and then to gently squash your defenders and say, no, shut up. They're right. Stop defending me. Like that's necessary. That's a necessary, important step. And I think also it's not just during, if you what I found so interesting about that was it's the work that you're doing beforehand of having enough people in your life who will call you on your shit and who aren't sort of all going to necessarily agree with you or share the same blind spot that you have. That's actually going to save you, right? Because in fact, you're right. It's in the moment when it's already too late, when everybody's yelling on the internet. It's not really too late. You can always. I'm not saying it's hopeless, but I'm saying your chances are far better if before everybody's yelling, you know what I mean? You've kind of created, or a community has created. I mean, it's not just about a person. It's about if a community has enough of these interleaving.
To be fair, I think we're still all learning how to navigate these social dynamics on a world stage, right?
Yeah.
And so things like when a magazine screws up or when an institution screws up, I think there was there's an immediate, people want a really fast apology. And I think one thing that we've that we're still learning is that, let's say a convention is messed up. You're talking about maybe 20 volunteers scattered across the world who have day jobs, who aren't being paid to do this. And now they have to navigate this very difficult thing. Right. And I sort of remember there was sort of a moment where we came to some understanding that the thing to do is immediately post something saying, we've just learned about this. We've heard about this. We're talking about it. We are 20 volunteers scattered across the whatever. We expect to get back to you within a week or 2 weeks or whatever with with something. And now
I think I saw that with the otherwise, with the Tiptree turning into the otherwise, with that conference. It was definitely there's this sense, and because the scale, it's not just that, first of all, everyone is now always talking into a microphone which might get turned on and broadcast to the world. It's usually not on, but at any moment somebody might in another room might switch the switch and you might be talking to the world. And the other thing is that we now expect YouTube scale, time scales of response too. You know what I mean? Or sort of like when I say YouTube, I mean a YouTuber who's just not, this isn't scripted. They're just, it's live streaming. They see it in the comments and they respond that. We expect that time scale of the instantaneous internet for.
So there's a certain human forgiveness, right? Of wanting to, I think we're coming to a better understanding of not just forgiveness, but just the human scale of it, of this isn't going to be instantaneous and it's okay. What we want is the acknowledgement and a sense that the person is working on it, right? And is going to get back to us in a reasonable amount of time, right? So
and I think there's also, again, there's a certain amount, there's it's the work beforehand matters, because it's Jed's idea, or it's not, Jed didn't make up this, but I always remember Jed talking about author points, the how much how much benefit of the doubt when you read a text, and it seems, if you read a text and it seems stilted and clumsy, and you don't know the author, you're like, well, this probably isn't very well written. If it's an author you trust, you're like, oh, I see the narrator has a stilted and clumsy voice. I wonder why that is, right? And similarly, there's a certain amount of credibility, that you have to establish. And this is when I take a new computer job, I sort of have this, we've talked to my wife Esther a lot, where it's well, there's a bunch of cram at the beginning. You know what I mean? There's a bunch of sort of like extra hours to establish credibility. Like the first couple of things you have to like, if you make the first couple of deadlines swimmingly, then all of a sudden there's a, you know, the way that everyone listens to anything else that happens on the project is totally different, right? Yeah. Like they are like, oh, well, we know that this is a reliable team, so obviously this is, whereas if you screw up the first, then everything is treated with suspicion and it balloons way out of proportion. Yeah. Like the amount of, like, so much work is saved by establishing credibility up front. Anyway, I'm just saying when an institution says we need a moment to think, if you have a certain amount of background trust in that institution, you're going to be like, oh, well, you know, of course, that's understandable. Yeah. If it's their, you know, if it's sort of they've eroded that credibility or whatever, then often you're like, oh, well, that's typical.
Well, so. And the author point thing is, I think, a good illustration of this, right? So just to, for anyone who hasn't heard about it, the idea is that you come into like a new text and the author has a certain number of points. If they can get points because you trust them already. They can get points from you very quickly if they have beautiful prose and you value beautiful prose, or if they have, you know, like there are a lot of things that you might have from the beginning, before the beginning, or at the beginning, and then they can spend those. So like a new Faulkner novel is going to come in with a lot of author points because people trust it, even though The Sound and the Fury is immensely confusing when you start it off, right? It's going to have a really good payoff. There's a reason why he's doing what he's doing. This is one of my 10 favorite books of all time, so I recommend it to everybody. And you know, whereas like if you're starting The Bone People, which is similarly confusing, maybe you don't know that Carrie Helm won the Pulitzer Prize, the Booker Prize, which that would give you author points, that you won this major literary award. But if you didn't know that, you'd be just like, who is this person? This is super confusing. This is another one of my 10 favorite books of all time. So those are my 2 recommendations for you. Sound and the Fury, The Bone People. You should read them both. And
there
you should
will be links.
And Delaney, lots of Delaney. But start with the short stories. Well, I don't know. Start with something shorter. Don't start with Dahlgren.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you should start with Dahlgren.
No, Benjamin. Are you kidding? No.
Or Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand.
That's a great one, but no, I think the one, I'm going to blank on the title, the short one about language and aliens.
Babel 17.
Babel 17. I think that's a good entry.
Sepperwerf one.
Yeah,
sure.
or the short story about the Frelks, which is what I give my students. I'm blanking on the title.
I and Gomorrah?
Yes, I and Gomorrah, which is also the title of his short story collection. Anyway, coming back to this, I want to finish what I was saying about author points in this context. And the novel I'm working on, one of the novels I'm working on, is a science fiction novel that you read an early draft of the opening. And it has not a rape scene exactly, but a rape scene. It has a scene of sexual coercion early on. And I'm still super hesitant about it because I feel like, okay, there's going to be people who come in and say, well, this is Marianne, I trust her to handle this well, and I'm going to, this is not going to be glorified, it's not going to be played for titillation, et cetera, so on, which I hope I don't. It's going to have long-term consequences and, so on. But I also have to kind of accept that there's going to be people who, either I have no author points with them because they come in knowing nothing about me and they've just picked up this book off the shelf, they start reading it, there's a sexual assault on page 10, and they're like, well, I'm done with this, and they put it down. Right.
Sure.
And there are going to be people who, it doesn't matter how, and this is what I wanted to get to, it doesn't matter how many author points I have, that's just a hard line for them. They don't want to read that. That's whether or not they think it should be done, like that's going to ruin any entertainment for them, right? Like and which I completely understand, because interestingly, like I can read about sexual assault and I'm okay, but I have a hard time seeing it on screen. So Kevin and I were once watching a movie, and it was some literary movie that did a very good job of it in some sense. I don't remember the title. I kind of blocked it out. Like I had to stop watching because it got to this coercive scene, and I was like, I know these characters, I'm invested in them, I hate this, it's upsetting me, it's making me think about all kinds of things in, and I've never been raped, but these coercive moments in my past, whatever, that were difficult. And I was like, I just don't have the fortitude to deal with this, and I'm just done, right? And I've never made him like stop watching a movie with me before. Like it was this moment of like, I'm done. You can finish this on your own, but I can't. I don't want to watch any more of this. So there's I think that connects back to the, you know, there are going to be people who you can't make enough restitution, I guess. You can't, there's no way you can make this okay for them, this thing that you did. And I think that's another hard aspect of this, right? There are people who are, you know, when people who won't read Orson Scott Card, won't read Bradley, I find that difficult, because Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead were, I think they're brilliant, and I think they're important humanist novels, and they were important to me. Bradley was incredibly important to me with her Avalon, with both what she did with Mists of Avalon, but particularly what she did with The Spell Sword and The Forbidden Tower, which has poly stuff in the context of this fantasy world of Darkover. But both of them have some major problematic ethical sexual stuff that
that
have
real life stuff.
Right. What? Sorry?
Yeah.
Like
the real life. Yeah.
In real life, which has led to a large portion of the community being like, I'm never going to read them again. I don't want to send money to them. And I totally understand that, right? Like, you know, there are people who
I also
have a hard time watching, but there's others, there are other ones where I'm like, well, I'm going to keep talking about Bradley, and I know that's going to be hard for some people, and maybe they're going to write me off as a result, right? And so
I mean, and I think there's also, I mean, there's a bunch of levels there, right? Because there's sort of like a decision level where it's like, or an ethical level where it's like, I'm not going to, you know, read Bradley or listen to Michael Jackson or whatever, because I think this, or watch Woody Allen movies, because, you know, this happens beyond the pale and I do not want to support it. That's like a conscious level. And then there's another level, which is just like, it just ruins it. Like, I just don't want to watch Woody Allen, because it's just like, it's aesthetically, that is a thing I know, and I can't not know it. And so I don't, you know, and
but there's like, you as an individual, but also you as a scholar and academic in the community, right?
Yeah, well,
like that's a different level. Like I don't want to watch Bill Cosby now, which is upsetting, because I used to love him, right? But I also have no obligation. I don't work in that field. I don't, you know, like I'm not writing comedy. I'm not working on. If I were like a scholar studying like comedy in America or Black entertainment figures, I mean, he's hugely important. You have to talk about him, I think, right?
Sure.
So,
well, and that's a different job, and there's a different context. And I mean, it's not, I mean, it's like, sure. And you should talk, I mean, if you're doing the history of early American cinema, you would want to talk about D.W. Griffith, right? I mean, you know, I don't know, and maybe Leni Riefenstahl, I mean, right? Like, I don't know, there, you know, I mean, and there's also people who are, arguably, you know, terrible, and it doesn't ruin it. Like, arguably, like on some level, I mean, on a purely aesthetic level, like the knowledge of H.P. Lovecraft's racism, I mean, honestly, like the stories are like he's less sympathetic. Like, seems more repulsive, but he never seemed that. Like, that's not a feel. You don't have a warm, fuzzy feeling for the narrator anyway.
So I don't know Lovecraft well, so I feel like I should go read him at some point, because I think it's an important aspect of the field. But I do think that sometimes the real world stuff permeates the books, right?
It does. Oh, that's my point.
Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Like, sometimes, like Wagner, I don't know. You know, like I'm like, I don't know anything about him.
I totally get it from Wagner, but in fact, it's funny, because sometimes I don't know anything about Beethoven's politics, really. But just from listening to Beethoven, I feel like he's an asshole. You know what I mean? But anyway, the thing I was going to say with Lovecraft is that the aesthetic is different from the political. Like, politically, if Lovecraft was alive and getting royalties or something, I'd probably be like, you know, no, you may not have any mind share, you're racist. But on the other hand, like, knowing that like, people have done these great riffs on Lovecraft, like Matt Ruff and everything, where you're sort of, you're sort of taking it. Yes, he was a racist. That's the whole point. Like his horror of like, you know, other kinds of people coming and miscaginations.
Right.
It's like shot through the books. It's like, but it's like there's nothing more Lovecraftian than Lovecraft going insane because people are brown. You know what I mean? Like that.
Right.
You know,
and like you see N.K. Jemisin, right? Her latest novel. I'm blanking on the title, but it's a Lovecraftian figure.
Yeah.
Creature breaks through into New York, and it's all about the different boroughs, and there's a lot of race politics in there, and she's just confronting it head on and making it, you know, part of it. I also
Lovecraft racism has been kind of a gold mine for anti-racist Lovecraftian writers, right?
Right,
like,
and another example of that, like there's a class I teach of sort of writers of color in science fiction fantasy, and we start the series with Conan the Barbarian. Actually, we start with your story, The Orange, but then because we have a whole thing about, you know, is Jewishness, you know, should people like Ben be included in this class on writers of color or not? And so that's actually what we spend the whole first class on, and it works really well.
It's hilarious that you've turned our very funny argument on the way to WisCon about whether or not I was white into an entire class. That's,
well, I
first class of a class.
That's got to be an episode. So, Darius, make a note. We got to talk about whether Ben is white or not. That'll be a whole episode in of itself. But brief note. I think I am. Yes, and I actually agree at this point, but it took me a long time to get there. So, so the second class is Conan the Barbarian. We read Queen of the Black Coast, which is hugely racist, like, as you know, like it's just like completely permeates. But then we read Charles Saunders, the opening to his novel Imaro, which is about a black figure, sword and sorcery type hero who is a Conan type figure, and seeing what Saunders does with that trope is fascinating, right? And anyway, I don't know, if you're listening to this podcast, what you're going to get from Ben and me is a lot of argument. Mostly we're on the same page.
We haven't been arguing that much this episode.
Not arguing against each other, right?
No. But sometimes we debate quite fiercely.
Yes. So, but a lot of kind of detailed nuance. And I would say we're both, you know, we were going to call this, like, what should we call this thing? Because we still don't have a title.
We haven't talked about that yet.
And I want to kind of like segue into that because I've been thinking about it sort of in the back of my head. And I have a couple possibilities. Like, we talked about the Marianne and Ben show. That's a little flat, I think.
That's a little on the nose.
Yeah. Well, I kind of like Marianne and Ben's traveling phantasmagorica, except that it's hard to say and hard to spell. So, but like that kind of sense of like wonders and marvels and like a roaming convention that could go almost anywhere. Something along those lines I kind of love. There's, you know, there's a memoir called, I can't remember the name, Mr. Somebody's with a W, Mr. Weschler's, I don't know, Cabinet of Wonders, and it's so I kind of like that concept of
marvelous flying machine, something.
Yes. So there's that. Another one I was thinking of as a title is about like being human. Because I sort of feel like in everything we've been talking about, everything we think about, and this is a very science fictional thing, it's a very fantastical thing, these kind of questions about what it is to be human. But I also think you and I bring a very secular humanist, maybe Jewish humanist, I don't know, but I bring a very secular humanist perspective to much of what I do, right? And, you know, you told me at one point that what I really wanted to be was a public intellectual, and I'm still, I think I agree, except I'm not sure exactly.
Perhaps among the things. You don't have to limit yourself to just that.
But you know, like, I don't know if I know really what that means exactly, because I'm not
sure I said you wanted to be that so much as that you
I am that.
Ought to be or are engaged in that. Anyway, yes.
But I think there's a question of breadth versus depth that I get a little hung up on, right? Because, and this is, you know, whatever, imposter syndrome, academia, you know, like there's a way in which I'm a generalist, right? You know, I have some specific knowledge in science fiction. I have some specific knowledge about Sri Lankan cuisine at this point after immersing myself for a few years. But for the most part, I'm a generalist and an enthusiast, and I care deeply about humanity. And I think you are in a similar position. Does that make sense? So anyway, that's
I like. yeah, I don't know if I like. I don't know if the human thing is clicking for me yet as the
Okay.
title, but I do think
Yeah.
that I like. I mean, I think it's interesting. There is a theme about specific and general. I mean, the thing about being a generalist is interesting because I sort of feel like that's one of the greatly fun things about being a science fiction writer in this era is that it's kind of like a um, still a space where you get to be this sort of, I don't know, 18th century notion of an academic. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
academia is actually analyzed is organized into very super specialized categories. Like when I was in high school, I had among the things that our little gang called itself was like the pseudo intellectuals,
Yeah.
because we kind of had this sort of badge of pride of like kind of accurate of saying like what we like to read things, and then what we care about is what the things make us think about. We
Mm.
don't really know what the authors of the things were meaning them to mean.
Right.
What we're going after here is having like cool ideas, cool brain things happen when we read these things. That is,
Yeah.
and like then I went away to a fancy schmancy college and I got like a fancy schmancy education, and it beat out of me the notion that I should just like have wild leaps between one thing and another, because really anytime I thought of any thought, there was a bibliography of things I really ought to read first in order to verify that I was carefully and in a carefully scholarly way making a defensible assertion, and it should have like a lot of qualifications.
But let me ask you a question
Yeah.
about this. So I feel like I go back and forth on it because I do I want to encourage that like jumping off point to a general discussion, but I do sometimes get really frustrated by the people who are spouting off without having done a
Oh yeah.
minimum of background. Like, I don't know
I
what
feel
that
like
minimum is, but like, whether it's right now everyone has become like an instant expert on
in
the
epidemiology.
pandemic, right? Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
yeah, right? Like,
No,
and I'm
no,
like,
no.
what the heck do I know about
Don't get me
epidemiology?
wrong.
Nothing, right?
Don't get me
Like,
wrong.
yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not endorsing the opinions of my 17-year-old self as like the ideal that we should all return to. I'm 50. It would be very unbecoming for me to have exactly the same. I mean, at 17, it's fine if you're like, I just read a thing and now I think a thing. I don't think that would be the correct position for me to take. But I am saying
Not
that
to,
there was
by the
kind
way,
of a
our sound engineer Darius Vinazar is 21 and is listening to all of this. So, so
enjoy it while you can, man.
we're, we're not dismissing
20-year-olds.
22. Sorry.
Well, in that case, it's too late. I'm sorry. The clock has run
Right.
out. You are required to be judicious and careful in all your utterances after 22. What I was going to say though is I think there was to finish that story. Then I got stomped on by this pile of books, which I had to read before I could think of anything. And it took me a long while to kind of crawl out from under it. Which is not to say I'm not sad that happened, because I actually think there is a richness and a depth, and I actually do care when I read a text now. What did it actually mean? Like what? I mean, you can never get at what it actually meant, but what did they? How would its first readers have taken it, and how is that different from how I take it now? And how, you know what I mean? Like I'm not just content with my first like thought about it. Right. And especially if it's something about, if I expect it to have a bearing on reality, like the pandemic, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But I do think that there's a lovely privilege in being able to, in writing science fiction is in a way the broadest remit. Literary fiction ended up in sort of a little bit of a cul-de-sac for a while, where the proper topics of inquiry were all about human interiority. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? You could write about what looking at a rainbow make you feel, but once you got into how rainbows work, you were kind of straying outside of. I mean, it could be a little bit of a clever experimentation of dumping in a little info dump coyly or ironically, but like you weren't really meant to sort of write a thing. You weren't meant to like write a literary fiction.
It's so funny. You say that, and I want to argue. I mean, I agree with you
go
broadly.
Ahead
no, I don't. I'm mostly just calling out it's such a funny impulse that I want to be like, well, but what about Nabokov and his butterflies, and but like.
Sure,
but
I mean, I'm not saying
no. I think you're
but
right.
it's always I mean, there's always counter trends, but certainly like your base standard. Whereas there's a way in which science fiction is this wonderfully wide field of play where you can either decide I want to write about loss and fatherhood, or you can decide I want to write about like would it be possible to like have a species where one would be like one have to have DNA work differently so that one organism has DNA and the other organism edits that organism's DNA. You know what I mean? And you can write about either a thing that's about the world or a thing that's about the self or a thing that's, and you just have to learn enough.
Okay. I mean, when you write about a thing that's about the world, isn't it always also about the self if it's going to be good fiction?
Yes.
Okay, yes, okay.
Exactly.
Because you could just write an essay about the thing, right?
Well, you could.
You could go off and do a science essay,
indeed.
right?
And in a way, when you write about the self, it's always about the world. It's just that there's a space to acknowledge both sides of it and to come from either angle. And I think that, because I think if it's not at all, I mean, it's also okay for it not really to be about the world at all. It's also okay for it just to be about self. But there's a way in which I think science fiction is strongest when it is not entirely collapsed to allegory. You know, when you're not only, like, of course, you're saying when you talk about the magical thing, it somehow metaphorically connects to the personal or emotional thing. But if it only is an evocation of the, you know, it's like allegory. It's like, well, they're vampires, but really they're just annoying people. Like that does lose something of the magic of it being this liminal space where it's like, oh, they're kind of also vampires.
Yeah.
But the thing about oh dear, have I lost my train of thought? So the thing about where was I? I'm 7 layers deep, and
I know. I got lost too. You were talking about the role of the, I don't know, the way we think.
Yeah, just the space of generalism, just the space of being, and the thing you're saying about, like, well, don't you need to know something about it? The interesting thing is that there's a wonderful bit where when you're writing fiction, you're evoking an imaginary world. It's good if you're not talking out of your ass to some extent, but I used to be much more scared of research. I used to be much more like, well, I can't write anything in historical, it'll be a bottomless pit. I can't write anything that, you know, I don't really understand that part of physics, you know, I can't. And now I'm like, you legitimately, it's a magic trick, a stage magic trick, but it's not illegitimate. You actually only need to really understand the part that you're shining a flashlight on. And in fact, in some ways, it can be very helpful not to, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you don't want to be, like, it's useful, I don't know, like, it's like, I will totally, like, go and, like, sometimes go and, like, calculate how many light years something is from something and how long, you know, and, like, try to estimate, like, the relativistic, you know, how long would, if we're going at a quarter of the speed of light, how long it would take or whatever, like, right? Like, I will totally geek out about details. But there's another way in which those details are there to, part of what I'm doing when I do that is not that I'm going to get anything right. Like, when I try to write science fiction that thinks about the future truly, it's not that I'm trying to get it right, because I'm not going to be able to say anything accurate about the future. And it's not that I'm pretending to expertise about the thing. It's more that I'm pushing my mind by forcing it to engage with some aspect of the real world.
So that's
because of.
So I find, as a writer, I think I have a lot of trouble trying to write science fiction that is more than a little ways out, right?
Yeah.
Because
this is a difference of ours, because I've
well, that's the thing, you do
14 billion years in the future.
You do way far future stuff, and it's always really fascinating to me seeing how you approach that, because I get kind of caught up in the realism of the extrapolation, and I get a little strangled, right? So I'm like, so right now I'm working on something that's like 4 generations out, set on a terraformed planet, and my jump space universe, and I'm trying to write some of the things that are leading up to that point, and I'm getting a little bogged down, lost in, like, making all the extrapolation plausible, realistic. Like, well, you know, if we had developed hologram technology, you know, I only want it so that I can have this scene where they're holding hands in their little hologram suite, you know, but if they've got the tech in 4 generations, that's going to have massive repercussions for the rest of the universe, right? Like, for all of humanity.
Sure. Right.
And I guess there's just a huge suspension of disbelief that we're not even going to pay attention to that. The readers just accept that, of course, this isn't realistic, because, in fact, like, you know, when we go to the moon and, you know, the space develops, you know, tech stuff that lets us have computers in our palms now these days, like, you know, Turing did not envision that, right? Like, so, and probably couldn't have envisioned that, or maybe he could have, but, like, I guess there were science fiction writers who were envisioning handheld computers, but Sorry, I've like rambled off here.
Including E.M. Forster. Well, maybe not handheld computers, but sort of the internet. But yeah, no, but I mean, that is a real interesting question, and I think also there's more than one kind of story and more than one kind of approach to the problem. On some level, I think you have to. What's really important is you're playing with the reader's expectations, and often when the reader is kicked out of the story, it's not the thing that they're looking at that's kicking them out of the story. It's the thing you didn't do before to set it up. And so in a way, it's like, if you take the right tone, then everything can be quite fanciful and the reader will discard any worry of, but on the other hand, if you kind of promise, like, we're going to be engaging with some aspect of the real world, I'm interested in thinking about this, you can't then bail halfway. I mean, nothing frustrates me more than, when some science fictional some of my friends hate going to science fiction movies with me because I will be like, I'll be like caught up and like, but if they had that, then they could have had that, and like so like I will obsess on plot holes more than many people who have a much easier time letting go. I mean, other things, of course, I love that are totally slapstick and silly, but that's the thing, is if it's I'm not expecting
part of that
science and Rocky
sort of like
Horror be right.
Setting the genre expectations correctly, right? Like we've been introduced. One of our pandemic things is that while we're sheltering at home, we started watching Doctor Who with the kids, starting with the reboot. So we've been watching it every night, and my son Anand is very analytically minded, right? So we had to have a big series of conversations about, no, you can't actually question the science of Doctor Who. It makes no sense, right? So like these have become catchphrases in the house, right? Like the science is not going to make sense. And this episode, the science really doesn't make sense. We just watched the episode where like every human on the planet has their DNA rewritten to become the master. Sorry, spoiler, but like it's
sure.
And like they just have Doctor Who just has everyone like shake their heads a lot, and then suddenly they turn into this other person, right? And like
right.
And so we have to be like, this is not even close, and that's okay, right? Because Doctor Who sets your expectations.
Yeah, exactly. Well, right? and there, I feel like with Doctor Who, there are episodes. I feel like you have to play by your own rules. Once you set the board, I feel like there are episodes of Doctor Who where I'm like kicked out of the story because it's implausible, even by Doctor Who standards, right? So whereas where I don't actually mind the master thing in a way, because I'm like, I feel like that plays by the rules of Doctor Who.
It was fine.
I feel like the one where the moon hatches into a giant dragon or something, and there's like little termites that live on the moon because termites live on it, like that, I'm like, no, even for Doctor Who. But there's a lot of them where I'm like, sure, that's timey-wimey. And in some ways I was going to say, in some way you were saying about it's like, me writing in far future things. In some ways, the more extravagantly far future, in a way, the easier it gets. You know what I mean? If you're trying to do near future, if you're trying to do medium-term stuff, you have to know how. The fact is that the technology on Gallifrey is so outlandishly far from ours that the idea that, I think maybe, it's not very hard for me to, I have something I call the minimal invasive retcon, which is how much do I have to tell myself in the background of this story? How much extra info dump do I have to add to make what's on the screen make sense? Right?
Yeah.
And so very often it's not very much. So in the case of the Doctor of the master rewiring everyone's DNA so they turn into the master, and they shake their heads and they turn into this, it's actually very hard because I just think he's using DNA as a shorthand. I think he's not actually, when he says DNA, he's just dumbing it down for humans because there's no way he could. But in fact, who knows? Maybe there are little femto machines in every single quark that he's inserted into all the quarks in the people, and they all synchronize at once. And, it's just like, I don't actually have all that much trouble supposing that Gallifreyans have a way. It probably doesn't have anything to do with DNA. He's probably using DNA as a metaphor, like he would say, like, it's like fire inside them. You know what I mean? He's trying to explain it to humans. But I don't know.
Let me ask you the question then.
Yeah.
So where I run into, again, trouble with this is, how to put this? When there is a mismatch between, so when things are really far future and there's all kinds of wacky stuff happening, but the characterization, etc., is very human realistic. Right.
Yes.
There's this.
Yes.
I have a little bit of so I don't know whether you've seen the recent series Star Trek Picard at all.
I haven't. I want to, but I don't have any. I don't have the right
watch it. I'll be super curious.
Well, I can't, but when I get somewhere I can watch it, I'll watch it. I guess I could buy it on iTunes.
You could buy it. It's. I mean, I'm a huge Trekkie, so you guys are all gonna.
I'm a Trek skeptic, but
yeah,
I like some.
I am an ardent Trekkie, which doesn't
I'm
mean
a reformed Trek hater.
Which doesn't mean that I won't critique it. And I have this incredible mixed reaction to Picard. I think I can talk about this without wrecking it, because on one level, on the characterization level, it succeeds brilliantly, which is what I would expect with Michael Chabon as showrunner, right?
I did not know he was the showrunner.
Oh my God, the scenes are beautiful. The little character moments between people are gorgeous. It adds, I think, a real level of literary quality to Star Trek that I love, that I'm not used to seeing in the TV Star Trek. I mean, I think Discovery also did some more stuff along those lines, but then where I have to say it failed for me is the overarching plot, which I won't get into so as not to spoil it, was too like fantastical, science fictional, fantasy. You know, the ethical questions didn't really make sense to me, and it ended up being a mismatch. Like, it didn't have a level of depth and realism and so on to pair with what was happening on the individual character level.
The interpersonal level had deep realism, and the sort of global, grander scale,
And I feel like that's where I struggle with my own science fiction. And I do sort of okay with short stories, but as you know, I've been trying to write a sci-fi novel for many years now, and I think I'm getting closer and closer, but I think it's very difficult to make those two things work.
Well, I'll tell you a rule of thumb I have. I have a really practical rule of thumb that I think I invented. I don't know, but I believe I invented. If I ever get to teach at Clarion, I'm going to teach it, which is, because I think this is a very useful rule. And I don't know if it helps at all with your question, but you reminded me of it, particularly when you were like this mismatch. Because I think often what happens is we have, one of the reasons that I watching older shows or like early Star Trek or something, and you're like, they are flying around the galaxy at faster than light, and they still have all these social mores of the 60s, for instance, or like not even that, or just like they seem to only live 70 years. You know what I mean? Like they have like everybody seems to be about the age that they would be, and they seem to expect to be dead by 100, even though they literally have talking robot. They have data, but apparently if you get sick, you die. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. We don't see any 300-year-old people walking around, at least. They don't tell us. And similar things. And it's sort of like you get the sort of Flintstones version of history, you know what I mean? Version of history, where it's like there was always like dad comes home from work, even in the Stone Age. Or actually I just saw on the internet some meme about how the Flintstones is actually set at the same time as the Jetsons, and the Flintstones is like, it makes perfect sense that Flintstones is like the post-apocalyptic, like that's the working class in the rich have fled to their cloud cities, and Fred is down there in the quarry. Anyway, so
you're killing me, right? Because you promised me this rule.
Oh yes,
was going to solve all my problems.
Okay,
and now you're going off and talking about the Flintstones at the Jetsons.
Sorry, here is my holy grail, but it's relevant because you were trying to avoid the Flintstones problem, right?
All right.
Which is taking your social norms and transporting them to some other era of history. Right. Here's my rule of thumb. I don't think this is necessarily true, but it's about what readerly expectations. If a thing, a technology, an institution, a social norm, is X years old at the time that I am writing the book, I believe that the reader's intuitive perception, intuitive baseline assumption, if I don't specifically justify something else, is that it will persist X years into the future.
Okay.
So the reader sort of, it's sort of related to the principle of mediocrity. The reader assumes that they are roughly in the center of history. Okay. So, bread, if you have 3,000 years in the future and someone is cooking bread, I don't really have a problem with that, because bread is 3,000 years old. Like, I expect bread to persist for 3,000 years. If you have 3,000 years in the future and someone is typing, using a mouse to manipulate a pointer on a screen, I find that a little sketchy. Like 3,000 years, like a mouse, like really? Like Xerox Labs hit it so out of the park that the mouse moving a pointer on the screen is going to last. I mean, maybe it could.
I mean,
but like it's a bit of a bet, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would say this has to be modulated by how good the technology is. Like, like we had scrolls on parchment for a while, and then we had books and the printing press, and like then that was a really good tech, and that lasted for a long time, right?
No doubt, and you realize what I'm saying. It can't be true in general because there wouldn't ever be anything, right? I mean, it can't be true in general. There's always a first. Any technology that's going to last 1,000 years, there was a first day it was invented, and then it definitely wasn't true that it would only live another day, right? Like what I'm saying is about reader-led expectations. It's not actually about how, but it is true in a sense that when you say computer mouses, they're really good. They're going to last. You are essentially like a very speculative investor. Like you could think of it as like you know what I mean? Like it's sort of like the bread is a blue chip. Like bread has been paying dividends for 3,000 years. The mouse, that just went IPO. Yeah. Like you can put all your money in the mouse, but if you're buying a stock option on the stock of mouse to be there in 3,000 years, I mean, it's a risky bet. So that's my point. People have this expectation, and you could do that with anything, like any social norms, right? Like I don't know, like marriage, like the way marriage like if you're writing something set 50 years in the future, and marriage 50 years in the future should feel about as different from marriage now as marriage in 1960. You know what I mean? Like it should be about that amount of gap. And that's what, and it's, when you see something written 500 years in the future, and the social norms are just like ours today, like there are, people are complaining about their bosses and then going home to their, and their wives are trying to find a babysitter. You're a little like, really? Because in 1600 that wasn't the case. You know what I mean? But and that gives you this great rule of thumb, I feel like, where you can be like, because obviously you can't make everything different, but there's a way in which you can be like, okay, if I'm writing very, and so in a way, if you're writing very far in the future, it's like, well, I get to spin all the dials, know, and you have to think about what dials there are to spin. Obviously, that's there's some level where if you get far enough out in the future, because I've written things that are millions and billions of years.
You have,
But at that point, you begin to, like, you can no longer be writing in the same kind of coherent, realistic style. But the thing that I have found to do in those cases is you explicitly let the reader in on the idea that to some extent this is metaphor. Like, let's call it a ship. Let's call him the captain. Like, of course that's not what we're talking about. There are no captains of ships 15 million years from now. But let's use that metaphor so that you and I can talk about this thing that's happening, right? And so there's that effort of translation, like we're translating. But I think that I think the rule in some level still applies. Like there you're calling attention to sort of that you're translating some things, but still it's sort of like you're like, what's great about this is it makes history this wonderful backstop where if it's suddenly Shakespeare becomes a really useful metaphor for a really useful mine of information for how I should talk about, let's see, how many years is that? Like, so you're right, that was what, like 400 years ago, right? So 2400 should feel like Shakespeare. Right. When I was writing a bunch of stuff set in the guy who worked for money and falling. I read a bunch of stories written in like 2050s Frankfurt, and sort of after 2033 they default on the dollar, money goes away. There's this whole new economy, and that's the whole premise of the thing. And when I was writing, I was thinking a lot about 1960. Like 1960 was as far away. So I was like, what has changed since what can we reasonably say? What's the same since 1960? What has really changed? It should be that far away, and that thinking about social norms, thinking about, it's
I think it's a good principle. I'll have to ponder it a little bit, but I like it as a guideline. I do, I think it's like when I give rules to my students, they immediately try to break them, right? Which is good. Yes, that's what they should do. So
definitely break them.
And so I'm thinking about like, well, what are the exceptions to this? And I'm like, well, what about singularity type events where everything changes radically, in ways that you wouldn't have anticipated, and so. But I'm going to put all that aside.
Yes, but sure. But I guess I'm not saying make everything. I'm not saying make history smooth. I'm saying the baseline expectation is. So in a way, it's like author points. You have a certain number of points to spend. If you want the story, if you want to have a mouse in 3,000 years, you're going to have to sort of spend a little of the reader's attention to be like, turned out mouse is a great technology. You know what I mean? Or if you want to have
and I think one of the ways I've been dealing with it in my books, in my stories, is what are the things that interrupt the progression of tech, right? So, there was 100 years of war, and that stalled things, threw things back, etc. Or we're trying to terraform another planet, and we've only got a couple hundred people. That's gonna change everything. It's gonna slow everything down. Maybe think people will get rigid about, social roles or whatever, because we're now in a survival setting. Or we're on another planet and we've encountered aliens, and they have now thrown a whole bunch of new stuff at us that we wouldn't have evolved on our own. So, and how is that?
But I'm also not, when I talk about this symmetry, I'm not talking about a Whiggish march of progress of like we were that much worse before. I'm actually talking about strangeness. I'm talking about alienation. I'm talking about, if you really think about 1500, it's very alienating.
Sure.
And is the benchmark of like, are you doing a good job of writing in the far future? I feel like, at least if you're playing this particular game, because it doesn't have to be, you could use a simulated. I think to some extent the reason how I learned to stop worrying and love Star Trek was to stop expecting it to play my game. Like to stop expecting it to do what I wanted it to do. Think, okay, this is a setting. There's a setting of space, and there's some really interesting character and philosophical dramas that they've decided for some reason to set on a spaceship. Like, as opposed to, and some Star Trek does better and others are meeting my original metric. But I'm not saying this is the only game to play. But a game I like to play is it this much estranging? And there have been disasters. I mean, there have been times in the Roman Empire was very connected, and then after that, Europe was split up into a lot of little fiefdoms for a while. And it's
and
not
I think,
like
I guess I would say what you do, I think your mind naturally does that better than mine, right? Like, my impulse is to essentially do what Star Trek does. What I think Bejeweled is in the same. This whole space opera genre,
interestingly,
perhaps,
Bejeweled doesn't trigger me that way. But anyway, go on.
Well,
I think Bejeweled, I don't know. Well, it's different. I mean, I agree that she's not playing quite the same game, but I think that she's making a certain, and I think you often.
I guess I'm closer to Bejeweled in some ways, but it's that same kind of like, I just want to take these issues, this set of concerns. I want to write. Like, I have that story Plea that's it's up on Lightspeed, guys. You can go read it. It's free. And it was, that story was the intersection of the Syrian refugee crisis, being in the news. I'd be listening to it on NPR as I was driving into campus and crying because it was just so terrible, right? And at the same time, my son had started kindergarten and was getting hauled into the office constantly. He had like 17 incidents in the first year, which turned out to basically be because of ADHD. He has a really hard time standing still, especially in line. So he'd be like bumping into other kids. That was taken as aggression. And so all of my anxieties about him, and as a mixed race kid, I'm brown, he's light brown, right? And then hearing people talking about the Syrian refugees and whether we should let them into the country, and well, it's okay to let in women and kids but not young men because there might be terrorists. All of that kind of coalesced into a set of anxieties around who gets to decide who is too violent to come to refuge, right? And and how is that differently applied to brown boys? And I, so I write this story about space whales and, telepathic space whales and this lesbian couple with kids, and it's actually a little girl who has a violent thought. And my point here, I guess, is that I could have written essentially the same story realistically, right? So I don't know that I did any of the kind of thing you're talking about in terms of extrapolating strangeness, whatever. Like, that wasn't my project. That wasn't what I was interested in doing. I wanted to not trigger people's, as you say, like, I don't want to throw them out of the story. So I want to do a minimum level of world building for plausibility. But what I was really interested in was talking about this issue using the cognitive estrangement of science fiction to be able to talk about the issue without triggering people's preconceptions about the Syrian refugee crisis, right?
But I don't think that that's so different. I mean, I think that's, I mean, I maybe talk now. I think now I talked about it in a sort of an extreme way, where I'm sort of like, you have to figure out if they use a fork, you have to think about whether the fork. But I mean, that's sort of like, I'm geeking out about all the details. But I think that cognitive estrangement is sort of rooted in the same idea that you're saying enough here is different that you can let go. You know, you can engage with this theme because I'm placing you somewhere. I'm taking you on a holiday. So it's not Syria, it's not Earth, it's not, and you know, and the amount that you have to do of the sort of, like, in a story that's full of like eyeball kick gimmick, wacky science fictional speculation, you have to do a lot of it because you've foregrounded to the reader that you're going to do a lot of it. But in a story like that, I mean, I love Le Guin, and Le Guin is not full of like, this device is, you know, but that's.
Well, and I would say I actually think I could push myself more on that, right? Like when I bring stuff to you and David Moles to critique, one of the things that I like about having you look at my work is that you start extrapolating all this stuff that I would not think to make weirder and stranger. And it's not the way my mind naturally goes. It's not I have to really work at it.
But I think it's a question: does it serve the story? You know, you don't need to make it weirder and stranger is not a goal in and of itself.
No, but it usually, I think if I put in a little more, it would make it better. It would, because it would do the work of cognitive estrangement more effectively, right?
Yeah, I think there's. I don't want to be taken as saying, you know, I don't mean to leave our listeners, if there are any, with if we end up shipping this one.
Yes. So.
I don't want to leave anyone with the idea that this is this rule that you have to put on this attention on making things sufficiently strange. I think there's a kind of science fiction that revels in strangeness, and there's a kind of science fiction that uses a little bit of strangeness to pry people away from their everyday concerns in order to deliver some other payload. But I think that you only need as much as you need. You know what I mean? So again, it's what you call your reader's attention to. Many science fiction stories that I love are very spare with the amount of detail that we get. They're essentially fables, you know? And that is very effective, but you don't need more. What happens is if you say to the reader, oh, look, here's a thing, you know, then you've called your shot, right? Then you've said, I'm going to put the ball in this pocket, you know? And so you have to, so the rule about thinking how strange is this is a rule you only, the corollary to that is you only need to deploy that when you're actually, when you're surfacing to your reader's attention that something is away about this world. You know what I mean? Like if you're, and you know, and yeah, and some of the time you can say, you know, some of the time it's okay for a certain amount of things to be like, surprisingly, this persisted. You know what I mean? And every reader's going to have their own idiosyncratic reaction. But I think it is about the, you know, it is just about sort of operationalizing the strangeness in cognitive estrangement. How do we wrap it? What's our next?
Well, I don't think we got very far with the titling thing, but
that's going to be the theme of the podcast. Is that like every episode we try to title the podcast and fail?
We at some point have to come up with something.
Well, we'll have to record 13 episodes in secret, and by the final episode of the season, we'll come up with the name and retroactively apply it.
Apply to everything.